hours, I guess it still is light there. And so do appreciate it. And just want to acknowledge Karen Grissom is a move to amender. We put this notice of the program on our just this morning, actually. So it seemed to have captured one person anyway. So do appreciate. I actually cut my teeth in working on social change through peace efforts by, as mentioned, working for the American Friends Service Committee, as you may know, a Quaker-related social action organization at the time of the National Nuclear Weapons Freeze campaign. So maybe some of you are nuclear weapons freezers going back to the early 80s when the Randys were running around, both of them, Randy Forsberg and Randy Keeler, both of whom came to Ohio as maybe they came to your neck of the woods to talk about building a nationwide movement to pass a law, not a constitutional amendment, but to try to end the nuclear threat that is very much with us today by calling for a national nuclear weapons freeze. And it garnered from coast to coast a lot of activities and was an effort that brought in many people who understood and recognized the power of military contractors and the role that they played in furthering military spending and perverting and corrupting the political process that remains with us today. So it is on that theme, sadly, but also not all bad news. I'm going to talk about what is out there in terms of alternatives and what people are doing, not to just respond, react, and resist, but to proact and to go on the offensive instead of just playing constantly defense, as we all seem to be doing when it comes to, you name it, whether it's this, effort in peace or healthcare or education or, economic justice. It seems like we are forever and ever and ever constantly responding and reacting to others' agendas instead of having our own. And so this effort, the We the People Amendment and Move to Amend, is trying to actually put the powers to be on their heels and try to create something that would restore, well, not even restore, because we've never ever had real democracy from day one. So if someone could share the screen, I do have a few slides that I wanted to share.
Give me just a second, Greg, and I'll make you co-host so you can share.
Okay, should work now. How is this?
Somebody with their graffiti speaks truth.
Yes, okay, how is this? Yes, right, it is much more sort of we the corporations than we the people. Well, I wanted to start by sharing with you some words of wisdom from this little booklet called Fish Discover Water Last by a guy named Richard Grossman, connected to an outfit that I became involved with in the mid-90s called the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, an outfit composed of a lot of frustrated activists, labor, peace, environmental, consumer, who each in their own way were constantly working for change, but never able to seem to get very far. Because metaphorically, once we got to first base, it seemed like we could go no further because of, it turned out to be the power and ruling and authority of corporate entities. So this group began to do the deep dive and unearth a rich and long history of we the people ultimately defining, authorizing, instructing what corporations could do. And that's sort of how the country began. But anyway, this book, little booklet called Fish Discover Water Last, begins with this quote by Richard Grossman. If I could ever get this. It is sometimes said that fish discover water last, And I think that applies to us. We've been colonized.
Yes.
We're colonized people. We've lived in a corporate culture for the last 100 years. We're surrounded by the icons and images and propaganda. And how many hundreds of millions of dollars of constant advertising? Well, now it's certainly multiple billions of dollars. It's affected our ability to think. We censor ourselves all the time. We censor our goals. We censor our tactics and strategies. We don't demand what we know we want and what we need. And that's what we need to begin changing. So I think Grossman sort of hit it right on the head of being mentally colonized and sort of censoring ourselves into what is we have been conditioned to think is possible, is doable, and what is not. What we've been told is out of bounds, naive, incapable, that we are unskilled and unprepared to bring about the change fundamental that we need. And so it is within that understanding of trying to decolonize our own minds as a stepping stone to taking the action required to bringing about change that's going to serve us, our communities, our country, and what remains of our natural world. And so that is what Move to Amend seeks to do. We are a coalition of several hundreds of organizations, more than 700, nearly 500,000 individuals committed to justice in multiple forms, as well as ending corporate rule and trying to build a legitimate, authentic democracy that is accountable authentically to the people, not corporate interests. Our goals are to pass what we call the We the People Amendment. It has a number, has been HJR 48 in the last several Congresses. It is yet to be introduced in the current Congress. We are awaiting that number, meaning 47 House Joint Resolutions to be introduced so that we can have that number 48 for branding purposes, so that each and every Congress, we have the same number, not so as not to confuse who we're working with. So it's somewhat inconvenient at times, but nevertheless, overall, we think it's worth it. This We the People Amendment in sum makes clear that artificial entities do not have constitutional rights and that money is not constitutionally protected free speech. Both, we think, right, pretty radical concepts. And the second goal that is even more far-reaching is one that we believe this amendment is just a stepping stone to provoke discussion and organizing about how to make real the promise of democracy through constitutional renewal that goes even beyond the We the People Amendment. Our values are, we believe very much, that we the people have never, ever been all the people. And so therefore we need to focus on anti-oppression and solidarity organizing with people who have been historically oppressed and sort of kicked in the stomach or punched in the face through eons. We work on building coalition and trying to build a movement at the national level. So that's vertical, but or horizontal, but vertically. We also are committed to grassroots organizing and working at the base. And therefore we have people and groups at the local level trying to educate, advocate, and organize. We're always trying to get ahead of the learning curve on political education, because I don't know about you, but I never learned about corporate constitutional rights when I was in school, or even early on with the Nuclear Weapons Freeze campaign or with the American Friends Service Committee. I didn't learn about how corporations were at one time controlled authentically by we the people. It's something we need to catch up with, and all the other issues related to corporate rule and money as free speech. And then lastly, this principle and value, very important to be both, and they're interconnected, politically and economically independent, because they go together. It's important not to be controlled with strings or levers that can temper or moderate what you're doing if you start being more effective and start achieving some change that threatens the narrative and threatens the powers. Our coalition is we have a national board and a leadership team that's very diverse, a staff of 6 or 7 people. We have local affiliates, that's groups on the ground, 40 or 50 of those, individuals, advocates that are Johnny and Jane Appleseeds working in their communities for the We the People Amendment. We have groups that are doing all kinds of work on many issues, one of which, though, is working on the We the People Amendment. So they're called amendment working groups. And we also have at the national level what are called caucuses. These are gatherings of people who come together around a specific constituency. We have a labor caucus, for example, and an environmental or what we call eco caucus. So people who are concerned about those respective issues connected to those constituencies. And then we have individual groups or many groups that we call partners, and then many independent supporters. The amendments, We the People Amendment, sort of in summary, is these three sections. The first, the rights protected by the Constitution of the United States are the rights of natural persons only. A radical concept, right? Only people are persons. Second, money is not free speech. If money is speech, then those who have the most money have the most speech. Not a real good definition of anything approaching authentic democracy. And what the amendment would do is it would allow, really for the first time, federal, state, and local government regulate, limit, or prohibit contributions and expenditures. And the third section is that nothing in this amendment shall be construed to abridge the freedom of the press. Now, you may know in the Constitution, there's two ways. The first way, all 27 amendments heretofore have come as a result of this first way. 2/3 of both houses of Congress, the House and the Senate, must pass the amendment resolution that we call House Joint Resolutions. So 2/3 of both the House and the Senate, and then 3/4 of states then, which number at the moment 38 by simple majority, would have to ratify. There is another way to do it. It's not been done, but it's been talked about, and in fact has been used as a lever or threat to pass and to get Congress to take action. And that's to call for an issue-specific or issue-specific constitutional convention. And again, it's been used to pass like the 17th Amendment that required direct election of senators from those initially in the Constitution being appointed by state legislators. Didn't want to act, so there were calls by many states to have a constitutional convention to do that. That seemed to have been enough to force and to scare Congress to take action, and one or two others, I think eliminating the poll tax and a couple of others, have resulted in Congress taking an action to pass a House Joint Resolution because of this real legitimate threat of a constitutional convention. So for that to happen, whether it's a threat or actually happens, 2/3 of state legislators call for a convention, for example, propose our amendments, and then 3/4 of states must ratify it. So those 2/3 of state legislatures calling for a convention would have to call for the very same items. Have, 5 states calling for these 2 things, 6 states calling for 3 other things, maybe one of them is the same. No, all of them would have to call for the identical number of, or one. So, there's fear right now of an open-ended constitutional convention. There is some legitimacy to that, but many states have passed things calling for a convention, but they've been all over the board. Many calling for eliminating the Bill of Rights, others a balanced budget amendment. I mean, all kinds of stuff, but so far, nothing that comes remotely close to just an open-ended convention. But that is a threat that we need to pay attention to and work to oppose, because our friends on the other side are threatening to work at reducing authentic, to whatever extent of democracy we have, and to eliminate rights of many persons who have been fighting for those rights from day one. Our strategy is building a coalition, building a diverse, multiracial and generational movement, community organizing, not just activism, and focusing on grassroots organizing. We have had hundreds, more than 700 communities pass either municipal resolutions or ballot initiatives calling for our constitutional amendment. So rights are for the people, something that was electrified here on the outer face of the US Supreme Court a number of years ago. And if I could ever get this thing to work. Here we go. So just a word briefly about US Constitution rights. In many regards, the US Constitution was a very revolutionary document, but it had its blind spots in terms of limiting human personhood to a very few number of people, mainly white male property owners, that at the time of the Constitutional Convention amounted to anywhere from 5 to 8%. Everyone else was considered to be less than a full person. The Constitution affirmed property rights over human rights, and much of US history since, from the initial ratification of the Constitution, has been a history of people who were not initially included in We the People, working to drive themselves into where they already should have been from day one. People of color, women, and more recently, young people. One of the things that corporations got that was right was understanding that we are not going to mention corporate entities included in the Constitution. They have no legal foundation in the US Constitution. They're not mentioned anywhere in any article. And that's because the revolution, US Revolution, was in part a revolution not just against the King of England and not just against the King's redcoats, but also against the King's sort of economic / political arm. And those were called crown corporate entities, things like the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Carolina, the Baltimore Company, the Maryland Company. These were chartered or licensed by the king, a group of people who were given this power and this ability, this protection, this shield, being a corporate entity to do the king's business, economic, but also to a certain extent political, this side of the Atlantic, to be involved in economic endeavors, trade issues, but also taxing, collecting taxes, governing, and the like. And so they were oppressing the colonists. And therefore, when the revolution occurred, not only did the revolution dispense with a sovereign king and get rid of the redcoats, but transformed, democratized, or constitutionalized these crown corporate entities. Thus, the Massachusetts Bay Company became the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Maryland became the state of Maryland, and so on. And these crown corporations, there still were entities to be created. There were no longer crown corporations, but companies that needed to perform important business to provide goods and services. They were chartered. The chartering now was taken over by We the People through our government at the federal level in a limited number of cases, but mostly at the state level via state legislators that created charters or licenses that were granted or revoked one at a time. This was the intention. This was the norm. This was the default. Political money had no rights. And just as maybe some of you at one time, or may still, operate and are professional people that require a license to practice your profession in your city, county, or state, and that license sort of lays out certain provisions or certain rules and requirements to do your profession, whatever that is, and that if you violate and break those terms and provisions, your license can be taken away and your ability to practice your business can no longer occur. That's what a charter was, and to a certain extent still remains, but originally was very dear in terms of very defining, very clear, very comprehensive in terms of what a charter said, what could be done and what could not be done. And just by way of an example, in many states, for example, out east, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and Connecticut, Rhode Island, Ohio, and the like, here's some basically standard provisions of corporate charters. Limited duration of a charter or certificate of incorporation, limited the amount of land ownership, limited the amount of capitalization or total investment of owners, limited the charter for specific purpose, can only do one thing. If you were chartered to build, tables, you couldn't build a mill, you couldn't go into the banking business. And the state reserved the right to amend the charter or to revoke them. And oftentimes the boards of directors had to be citizens or residents of the county or of the state charter was granted, or where that business did most of its business in. So corporations could not engage in any way, shape, or form in political activity, nor in very many cases, even in charitable activities. The fear was that a community or a nonprofit group or a group of people would become dependent and would then become defending that company, when we, the people, felt the power and authority and rule and role of charities and of charitable purposes should be for the state and for individuals, not for these corporate entities. So here's just an example of when a legislature or a court found that a corporation violated terms of its charter. This is what happened. It was revoked. And here's just the wording of one example of charter revocation, this being in the state of Ohio in 1900. And you gotta love this wording. The time has not yet arrived when the created is greater than the creator. And it still remains the duty of the courts to perform their office in the enforcement of the laws, no matter how ingenious the pretext for their violation may be, nor the power of the violators in the commercial world. That is true self-governing stuff, in which people define their creations, not negotiate, not request, not plead, but define what companies can not do. So corporations didn't like all this democratic muscle flexing taking place at the state level. So they developed a couple different strategies to try to escape democratic control, beginning with first shifting decision-making to define corporate entities from one state to another. So if you were chartered in a state that legislators took this chartering business seriously and were very rigid and democratic in making sure companies didn't act beyond their stated authority and act independent from their charter, they would move. They would recharter in a state that was more charter friendly, which sort of a century ago was New Jersey. And today it's Delaware, which only out New Jersey. So about 60% of all companies, Fortune 500 companies today, are chartered in Delaware. That basically allows companies to write their own charter. So there's no real strong definitiveness toward what a company can or cannot do through a charter in some states, as there is in a place of Delaware, like Delaware. Second, companies shifted decision-making to define corporate entities from the state to the federal level. If you think about it, initially 100 years ago or more, it was hard enough if you're a resident of a county to sort of influence your state assembly person, your state representative, your state senator. Still, it's possible, but relatively speaking, much easier to do than your federal representative. So with a company being able to define and work at sort of shifting authority and decision-making from the state to federal level, it becomes much easier to try to influence federal officials and make them less accountable to citizens than state officials. So a very effective means to just try to shift the power to define what is going on from the state level to the federal level. So things like antitrust laws that were passed by statute, by laws in many states, were much stronger than what became a federal law that preempted state laws, the Sherman Antitrust Act, that was much watered down than the much more strengthened state laws. Third way, companies shifted decision-making from one arena to another is when shifted decision-making corporations did to define corporate entities from the legislative to the regulatory arena. So the regulatory arenas, regulatory agencies, the first one being the Interstate Commerce Commission that was meant to regulate railroads, was basically captured by the railroad industry. So there's a big advantage to sort of shift decision-making to an arena where you can have much greater influence in trying to get former, in the case of the Interstate Commerce Commission, railroad executives to now become sort of the foxes in the henhouse. And that's how many regulatory agencies even today operate. And plus, at the period where regulatory agencies were first created, it's important to know that corporations were trying to beat back culture of the day that was calling for public ownership of things like railroads and of utilities. So far better to be quote unquote regulated, but still be a private corporation than to be taken over entirely and be publicly owned, as was the case and called for. And in fact, the case in many states. And lastly, get this here. Corporations shifted decision-making and worked to shift decision-making from the legislative to the judicial arena. Legislative being the arena where we have at least some opportunity, we the people, to influence those we elect, to the judicial arena where in courts, if you think about it, we have basically no role and no voice in shaping decision-making. Thus, the court granted corporate constitutional rights. And voila, eureka, we've given people's constitutional rights to corporations. Long live corporate personhood. If you think about it, it's sort of like what happened is corporations were able to insulate themselves in sort of a castle surrounded by a moat, where we the people are no longer sort of debating things out on the grassland. Rather, we're now sort of on the sidelines, only able to hurl rocks at this castle, but not being able to penetrate it, not being able to have a real voice in the castle at all. We're just on the outside cheering or booing what's going on. And that castle is surrounded by water. Not only surrounded by water, but that water happens to be surrounded and infested with alligators. So no way to get inside that castle to try to influence what those justices are up to. And so thus, just to sort of summarize, corporate constitutional rights or personhood was not originally intended, not inevitable. It's not like the tides or gravity. It's not irreversible, not created by any past law or regulation that was passed by any elected official or by any citizen initiative anywhere across the country. It's been consciously planned and been a deliberative effort by corporate attorneys and activist judges. And basically what we say is, if anything has been consciously planned, it can be consciously unplanned. If it's been deliberative and it's been created, well, we can uncreate it. And that's what we're trying to do. And so it just should be said that business corporations don't need constitutional rights to do business. They need statutory rights or abilities. Statutory rights are basically laws that allow, in many states, in every state, in fact, at the state level, and there are even federal statutory rights of corporations that allow businesses to form and enter into contracts, to be able to sue and be sued, to be treated as a unitary entity, to conduct business, to do all sorts of things, to just be a business and function as a single entity. That's what a statutory right or ability is. We have no problem with those kinds of abilities or rights. The We the People Amendment doesn't address statutory rights, only constitutional rights, abilities, or protections. So what's happened is that the corporate entities have hijacked the First Amendment. Political free speech, for one. That goes back to 1976, Buckley versus Vallejo decision, the first time that money was defined as political free speech. 2 years later, in 1978, First National Bank of Boston versus Bilotti was the first time corporations were granted political free speech. At that time, it was just based in a Massachusetts law that only focused on allowing corporate entities to spend money to influence legislation unrelated to their business. So they couldn't be involved in any kind of electioneering, only for a ballot initiative. And that was in 1978. 2010, Citizens United versus FEC is sort of when corporate entities, as Ron mentioned early on, gained much greater rights to influence what's going on in elections by the creation of independent expenditures. And, as sort of these two items here, the decision was based on, quote, the right of persons to listen to speech, regardless of the source. And second, the corporation simply being an association of people with collective free speech rights. So what the court said is that, listen, the corporation is simply no more than a collection of people, an association of people, and they should have this collective or associational free speech rights. And that decision allowed an expansion of spending money, create these 501c4 organizations, expand them. 501c4s were around and were used in a limited way prior to Citizens United, but it expanded the way that they were perverted and corrupted by corporate entities. So since Citizens United and FEC decision in 2010, you can just see a dramatic rise each and every year, whether it's a presidential election. This sort of has presidential elections, but the trend is the same in off-year elections, where the rise is, and you can see it's pretty much a rise not only by Democrats, but not only by Republicans, but by Democrats. It's going up and up each and every year. And, you know, as the Chinese saying goes, you are likely to end up where you are headed. And right now, where we are headed is just the corruption of money in elections that just drowns out the voice of people without money. And those basically are only people who are weighing in any fundamental way are people of wealth, extreme wealth, and corporate entities. So it's not just, okay, it's not just speech. It's non-political speech, meaning corporations have hijacked the First Amendment, not just right to speak, but all sorts of other ways that speech has been corrupted, including, where do I want to go here? Here we go. The right not to speak. So an example, Florida state law a number of years ago granted political candidates the right to equal space to respond to criticism by a newspaper of their record. Well, that was overturned by the court based on the newspaper's claim that they should have the right not to speak or not give people the right to speak, which in essence is the right not to speak. So that was what's called negative free speech, and the Supreme Court granted it. Another instance, a Vermont law requiring the labeling of products containing bovine growth hormones was overturned based on the corporation's right not to speak. So here you have an example where the good people of Vermont were able to collectively get their legislature to pass a law saying, you know, to protect the health, safety, and welfare of consumers. And in this case, you know, dairy food, food given to mothers and to children, and mothers wanting to know if there's bovine growth hormones in that and wanting to make sure that that food is labeled with that. And so Vermont law required that. That was overturned. So the corporate right not to speak preempted, or dare I say trumped, the right of people to know, the right to know whether their food is safe. So an example here of not the First Amendment right to speak, but First Amendment right not to speak. In other instances, Exxon says that climate lawsuits violated its right to free speech. They shouldn't have had they shouldn't be able to turn over internal documents because that claims, their claim that, that's giving up our right to not to speak. And Monsanto claimed the right not to speak about Ready Roundup, which, as you may know, contains glyphosate, a chemical that has caused cancer to scores, thousands of people all over this country and around the world. Definitely a carcinogen that their own internal scientists claimed was the case, and Monsanto claimed, nope, we shouldn't have to turn over that. So again, instances of corporations claiming their right not to speak. And lastly, Burwell Hobby Lobby. Maybe some of you have heard of that decision that goes back to 2020. It didn't specifically overturn or expand the religious rights of the First Amendment to corporate entity, to business corporations, but they did say that the Supreme Court recognized a for-profit corporation under the law, the federal law, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, that a female employees didn't have the right to be protected by, not to be given contraceptive healthcare coverage. So, the decision permitted the corporation to deny contraceptive healthcare coverage to their female employees by invoking this federal law that they said they fell under as a business corporation that the Supreme Court went along with. So that's just one corporate constitutional rights beyond First Amendment free speech rights. Another is search and seizure. Corporations have claimed that they have the search and seizure right to prevent inspections of corporate property through warrants. So efforts to by regulatory agencies to protect the health, safety, and welfare of communities, of workers in plants, of the environment, to make sure that a plant is not spewing out dangerous chemicals that might or trains that may derail, as has happened in our state of Ohio, that any effort to try to inspect beforehand, sorry, you don't have the right to a warrantless inspection of my property, of my business. And, Section 8A of the Occupational Health Act of 1970 and 1978, this decision overturned that act because OSHA passed this law saying the inspectors should be able to come in without having a warrant. And the Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional because it was an unauthorized inspection without a warrant. Now, if you think about if we had had this sort of Fourth Amendment search and seizure rights, it's quite possible that the Enron scandal or that the Wells Fargo Corporation scandals, if we had known and been able to look at the books beforehand of these companies, we might have been able to discover how they were hiding and concealing and keeping away from the public their behavior that cost investors, cost customers millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars collectively. For example, it used to be in many states, if you were a banking corporation or others, banking in particular, that once a month for a couple of days, you had to have your books inspected. It would be left out basically in the lobby. Financial books for anyone to come and inspect. Now, you may not necessarily know what you're looking at, but nevertheless, if you knew what you were looking at, you could inspect those books and see whether that bank or whether that company was actually saying in earnest what they publicly are saying to their investors or to the media or to the like. But of course, we can't do that when you have Fourth Amendment search and seizure rights. Compare that to the claims of search and seizure rights that we have that basically are each and every day diminishing. Our Fourth Amendment rights through wiretaps and through computers and through cell phones and through every other thing. AI now, that if we ask Siri, that's being captured and collected. Everything we do today basically diminishes our personal and privacy rights. But corporations, nevertheless, have Fourth Amendment search and seizure rights. Another effort is Fifth Amendment. Fifth Amendment shall protect property, private property, individual property from government taking unless it's for a public purpose and unless people are individuals justly compensated. But this instance in 1922 where a Pennsylvania coal company sued a Pennsylvania law that prevented a coal mining company from continuing to dig coal. And basically what this law said is many homes, as this picture shows, were basically collapsing due to the digging of coal underneath this whole swath of communities. And so the state passed this law preventing the coal company from doing that digging. The company went to court saying that is a violation of our takings clause. You just can't do that. It's for a public purpose, but you're not justly compensated. The state said, well, wait a second, we gave you a permit, but you don't own that coal. You got a permit to dig it up, but you don't own it. It's not yours. And we're just trying to use our quote unquote police power, gives us the right to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. Well, the court went against that and said that you have to justly compensate monetarily that coal company for lost future profits. Well, the problem with that is taken to an extreme today is that if you think about the efforts now, right now, in which people who are working against the climate catastrophe that is right before us, any effort to try to prevent the burning of any fossil fuels by keeping those fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, even nuclear, in the ground from not being burned, from not being used, from not causing a burning of methane or other particles that warm the environment. Doing that results potentially and actually in quote unquote, what companies say, fossil fuel corporations, in lost future profits, potentially to the tune of trillions of dollars, if not tens of trillions of dollars. And so they're saying, no, you can't do that. You can't pass laws at any level of government unless we are justly compensated. What an incredible that would be for the passage of any democratically enacted law to try to protect the health, safety, and welfare, and in fact, potentially to save humanity from climate destruction. And lastly, the 14th Amendment. This was really the first time corporations were granted, although it was a bizarre decision, equal protection and due process, in which back in 1886, court granted that a county cannot tax a railroad at a different higher level than what an individual is taxed at. And so they said this violates equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment. The corporation or the court went along with Southern Pacific Railroad Corporation. And as a result, for the first 50 years after its passage, when the 14th Amendment was brought before it in court, most of the time it was corporations that were using the shield of the 14th Amendment to protect itself in the face of efforts to try to make corporations accountable. So as you can see, in the first 50 years after its adoption, less than 0.5% of cases brought before the court were brought before it by members of the Negro race, and more than 50% by corporate entities, and those representing corporate entities. And basically, you know, an example of that is, if I can ever get to this, is it now becomes impossible. I don't know about your community in San Mateo City or county, but there are many communities around the country that really work at trying to lift up locally owned businesses and will work, in fact, in trying to give locally owned businesses a leg up in some sort of way, advertising or giving preferential treatment, maybe tax breaks or the like. Well, you can't do that when it comes to basically any sort of monetary support, because going all the way back to 1933, and there have been other instances since, that when people in the state of Florida passed a law that levied higher taxes on chain stores than on locally owned businesses, the Supreme Court said, nope, that's a violation of the due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment. So here is an amendment that was passed intended solely to protect and apply to African Americans, newly freed Black slaves that have been hijacked, perverted to protect entities, in this case, protect major corporate entities, big businesses, chain stores, from locally owned businesses and from communities that want to protect locally owned businesses, that hire people, that the owners live in the community, that are responsible to the community, as opposed to chain stores that have, you know, who live half a county away, half a state away, if not half a world away. So just to sort of sum up here, women's rights and corporate rights, you know, women, it took how long before they won the right to vote versus corporations winning the right to and equal protection going all the way back to 1886, if not before. So this is a chart that we hand out on, you know, Women's Rights Day and the like, that just shows the disparity between women's rights and corporate rights. In fact, in 1875, there was an effort to try to say that the right of men under the 14th Amendment should apply to women. Or the right, we're limiting the right to vote. I should say the 13th Amendment should apply to women. Well, that got overturned through that decision. So there's just this huge disparity between the rights of women and the rights of corporate entities. So I just wanted to kind of end this by briefly sort of talking about the various corporate sectors that are out there. Some believe, for example, that the fire sector, finance, insurance, and real estate is the most powerful corporate sector in our country today. Others, the sick care industry, what I call sick care, meaning the insurance, medical insurance corporations, pharmaceutical corporations, hospital corporations are the most powerful, politically powerful. Others, well, actually, it's the military, contractors. And you can make a darn good case for each and every one of them. And maybe we can get more into the conversation, but I just put together what I thought is a chart that talks about what I think is the power of the military industrial complex and the factors, and I think disproportionately the advantage that the military industrial complex or military contractors have over the others is the dominant cultural factors that lift up and that underscore and justify all the military spending, war spending that goes on, from patriotism to the national security state, raising up fear and using secrecy to prevent what's really going on and how much money is being spent, right? How long has it been since there's been a full audit of the Pentagon? How race has been used to sort of foment enemies and declarations of war in the Middle East and elsewhere. The whole cultural notion of manifest destiny, that people in our country are sort of God's chosen people, that we have the power, the privilege, and we're the most noble to really say what's good for the rest of humanity, as well as the glorification of violence, of wars and guns in our culture that's infested laterally, horizontally, and vertically. So the dominant culture is just a huge undergirding or overarching to justify military contractors and the spending to create weapons and to basically have perpetual war. But there's also these economic factors. If you think about it, maybe building weapons is about the most dominant and thorough and widespread example of a national industrial policy that we have in this country. What does this country really produce? We offshore just about everything. We don't make anything to any great extent. Okay, we export movies, and now we're sending out natural gas, which is a sort of what third world countries do. But in terms of building things that you export, it's weapons, and that creates jobs. It puts money in communities and taxes. It's one of the things that offsets the negative trade balance that we have with other countries. There's a positive trade balance in selling weapons, and sometimes to both sides of a conflict, as we've done in the Middle East for decades. So the national industrial policy is sort of an incredibly strong economic factor in promoting weaponry. And another economic factor, it's sort of half economic, half political, is the decentralization of military contracts. Many huge weapon systems, B-1 bomber, for example, it was sort of broken down, was it not? Basically in every single congressional district around the country to get buy-in, to make it difficult to oppose it when everybody has got sort of skin in the game. And now increasingly you're seeing the privatization or corporatization of warfare with different elements of what used to be done by the Pentagon now being farmed out by corporations to feed people or to train people or even to develop military strategy. It's incredible. So all of that provides the justification for the political power of the contractors, the lobbying and the political investments. But that's not the only thing. The lobbying and the political investments is what the Move to Amend We the People Amendment would address. But my God, there's all these other factors. They are a triangle of Congress and contractors and Pentagon together that form this triage of power and authority that perpetuates warfare. And because of the economic conditions of the national industrial policy and the decentralization of contracts, you now have this diverse grassroots support for continuation of warfare, right? You've got all the people who work in the military industry, all the mayors and city council people, and nonprofit organizations that get the charitable contributions from the weapon systems, from the weapon contractors in all these communities. So it's just incredibly a powerful and effective nucleus. So but there's weaknesses of the military industrial. Won't go into this too much here. Trying to change this. It's not allowing me to do that. Okay, here. Where there's an alternative cultural items, just the opposite of what we've seen from the last slide. There's a global people-to-people connections. There's dangers, increasing dangers to weapons and guns. A greater recognition that humans are part of nature, never mind his destiny. There's greater acceptance of diversity that's offsetting cultural racism in our country that's still obviously extremely strong, but there's a pushback. And economic considerations, there's a recognition that because of automation, contractors just don't create as many jobs as they used to. The economic policies of, we have to just continue to grow. That's why we're, invading other places to get markets and to keep, building things. This growth in perpetuity is unsustainable. We're running out of resources and we're running out of a clean world and a livable world to do that. There's a threat of the dollar no longer being the world's reserve currency. Our involvement in Ukraine and forcing Russia and freezing their assets has caused a panic, not only in Russia, but in China and other countries that use the dollar as a reserve currency to say, wait a second, maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we should look at other currencies. And so now they're setting up, currencies between themselves and the like. Well, it's the dollar that's allowed us to continue to go into debt by trillions of dollars that just allows us basically to print money ad nauseum. Well, if that ends, guess what? Guess what happens to our economy? And there's a declining faith in capitalism by young people and the like. So all of that has positive, I think, political connotations, including the declining widespread belief that wars are winnable, a growing international solidarity, and rising interest in system change, in things like constitutional amendments that are focused on we the people amendment, but so much more. All right, just lastly here's just a listing of past social and democracy movements that have gone on since the springing of our country, from the Bill of Rights to slavery being abolished, civil rights acts, the passage of the 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment. These were people amendments, people organizing on the ground to do this. National social change, the 8-hour workday, the populist movement, the directional election of US senators in the early 20th century, women achieving the right to vote, Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil Rights Acts, the 26th Amendment, voting age change to 21 to 18. And more recently, we've seen women coming together, students coming together, Black Lives Movements coming together, the climate movement coming together. It's just incredible, the movements that are coming together. So I just want to end by talking about what Move to Amend is trying to do, where we are. We've had 95 co-sponsors in the last congressional session, almost 500,000 individuals support this effort. More than 700 organizations have endorsed our initiative. 9 states have passed either resolutions or citizen ballot initiatives calling for ending corporate constitutional rights and money as free speech. And more than 700 municipalities have passed resolutions or passed citizen-driven ballot initiatives. Our strategy, as mentioned before, we're trying to build a coalition that's brought in, it's multiracial, that's intergenerational, that's not only vertical and horizontal, but that's focused on the grassroots, that continues to try to gather as many local and state resolutions, organizational, as well as initiatives at the local level. Here's things that people can do to take action. I'm going to put in the chat momentarily a video that's been put together, 4.5 minutes, by Peter Coyote. Many of you may know that voice when you hear it. He's the guy who's narrated basically all the Ken Burns series on PBS. He's also narrated the Olympics, one of the Olympics. I don't know if it's a recent one or not. There's a listing of corporate constitution. Anyway, he's narrated this 4.5 minute video that we put together. Please share it far and wide. It explains in 4.5 minutes what I've tried to do here in 45 minutes. Check out our corporate constitutional rights resources, sign our motion to amend initiative motion that I mentioned before. Upwards of about 500,000 people have done so. Consider, please, your group endorsing us and add to the 731 organizations that have already done so. And I notice actually that the city of San Mateo has not endorsed or not passed, your city council has not passed a resolution calling for ending corporate rights and money's free speech. That may be something that if one or more of you want to do would be great. And lastly, something to do is we will be reaching out to whoever your representative is, if he's or she is someone who we think is someone who we can get to become a co-sponsor, did last time, or is a new person. We try virtual gathering, a meeting with a aide to that representative. We'd love to have a representative from your group be on that delegation to talk about how the work you're doing intersects or connects with corporate power and corporate rule. I just simply end by a couple of quotes. Victor Hugo, all the forces in the world are not so powerful as an idea whose time has come. David Thoreau, there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. We think we are root strikers. And lastly, nature never gives up, and neither should we. Sorry for taking so much time.
Oh, glad your voice maintained itself throughout. That was wonderful. I like that last one about nature doesn't take a break, and we shouldn't either. Thank you so much.
Will you be
Anyone,
putting some of those into the chat?
Yeah.
They were up on the screen, but they're not actually in the chat, so people can click the link.
Yeah, I'm working on that right now.
Okay, great. So
questions, comments? Glad
yeah.
to cuss or discuss anything.
Curious if you could send along perhaps an example of some of the municipally passed resolutions, because we had one year or two back about mayors for peace, and they were perfectly happy to sign on to that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and yeah, yours may take a little more explaining, but the fact that I think they're all a little concerned with the power of money, especially several, I think, propositions we had in this town a couple of years back were buried in money from across the nation, from real estate people and realtors being violently opposed to our trying to stabilize the rents. We've had runaway rents in this town. It's a very desirable place to live, but it's become an unaffordable place to live for especially the children of so many people that own homes and live here. And they just buried us, with the amount of, it was like 10 to 1, the funding that went for signs saying don't, I think it was Measure Q or whatever the hell it was.
Right.
And, it might resonate because they just recently passed funding limits for the elections for city council members. I was kind of proud of them doing that, on federal level, I think you're kind of constrained, but local levels, you still can put some limits on that type of thing. Karen, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, this is kind of exciting for me because Redwood City is my hometown, and I'll be there in 2 years. And when you talk about the housing issues, I certainly understand that in around San Mateo County and Redwood City. You probably know the name Diana Reddy,
yeah,
working on housing issues. She was a classmate and friend. And the other thing I wanted to mention, we have so much to work on the rent issues. There are large conglomerates that are setting rates nationwide. And one of them was already in the Senate Antitrust committee under, oh, I'm forgetting her name, Minnesota, Amy Klobuchar. And so many issues, and just a little note, move to amend, or rather Democracy Unlimited of Humboldt County was the first county in the United States to keep outside money out of local politics. And it's been a number of years ago, and it worked for 4 years before the Supreme Court overturned it. I just thought I'd share the local thing since I was a California girl.
Oh. Yeah, see, that would have been a welcome item to have. Like you say, the Supreme Court seems to have put the kibosh on so much of that stuff.
Right.
But, yeah, it was money across the country that buried this effort we had. And I think the only town that succeeded thus far, the whole 2 counties, Santa Clara and San Mateo, was Mountain View, I believe, did pass some rent stabilization legislation, and I believe it still stands. But yeah, that was
The link that I put in of endorse organizationally. If you, no, you were talking about municipal resolution. If you go to the pass a municipal resolution, if you click on that link, it'll take you to a page that has a link to all the communities around the country that have passed a resolution. City councils, town councils, village councils, as well as ballot initiatives, and a form, sort of a template. It'll take you to a template of a resolution that you could share with your city council person or persons in whatever community you may be. You know, this is a local issue. You know, you're mentioning about how things get passed at a local level and sometimes they get overturned. Well, this is exactly why in many instances, local communities and local officials feel that their ability to protect the health, safety, and welfare of their residents, that they're incapable of doing it because, you know, passing a local law that tries to limit fracking or that tries to limit, you know, any variety of use or purchase or possession or showing of guns in the community, or even preventing or using plastic bags, as innocuous as that sounds, or raising the minimum wage to $15 or more. A lot of these kinds of laws that have been passed, statutes that have been enacted at the local level, have been preempted or trumped by corporate entities that either go to the state level and get state legislators to overturn or go to court by saying, hey, you are discriminating. You know, you are violating my 14th Amendment or, you know, my right to do business by doing this. And they win so often that anymore, you don't have many of these laws even being passed because it's created a chilling effect. They know that if they pass it, it's going to get overturned and then they're going to have to pay court costs. So it is a local issue, and therefore it's worthwhile to try to bring up to localities.
Oh, we certainly want something that might have passed muster elsewhere, because you don't want to set them up and then have it just knocked down the next time it goes to court. But
Right.
it's
And
still,
so what this resolution is saying is, you know, we support this changing the amendment because you just can't do anything basically at a local level. You're boxed in. Democracy has become a box that, because of these Supreme Court decisions, becomes smaller and smaller in every direction. They are eliminating our right to decide via home rule, you know, at a state level that limits the ability of what communities can do, and or corporate constitutional rights. So, you know, people who want to try to do good governance can't do it recently because of these corporate constitutional rights.
doesn't bode well for our general democracy, actually, because the corporation is very rarely could it be considered a democratic bastion. You know, it's usually top down, and even these shareholder movements, a lot of those have been diluted lately, that, you know, you've got to have a certain number of shares.
That's right.
You
I
know,
see
so-
Laura has had her hand up for a while. Laura, did you have a?
Yes. Oh,
Oh,
thank
sure.
you. Thanks, Greg. Yes, I was amazed at the history of how we basically lost any control over, or the corporations gained control. And I was thinking of the one where you said at one time, a corporation couldn't donate when they had, it was something about them. Well, just recently in South San Francisco, we gained well over 4,000 signatures to get a measure on the ballot that would have put a parcel tax on, would have given free childcare, early education to every 2.5 to 5-year-old in the city. And it was going to be a parcel tax on the biotech in South San Francisco. Well, they spent almost $500,000 to pepper the airways every single weekend before the voting with commercials. And they just played nonstop. And there was, you know, you try to say, look at who's putting on all this money in this ads, but you can only get so far. And we still got 43% of the vote in an off-year election, you know, a mid-year election, but still, if we weren't fighting up against that, I really think we would have passed that for the city of South San Francisco. So, but
Well,
I
that
was,
Yeah, sadly, one of so many examples like that.
I'm wondering if they would have attacked it if you did succeed on the basis of equal protection, that, you know, you're picking on big cap, higher capped corporations rather than across the board or something. I'm just wondering how else they would have handled that. I wouldn't have been at all surprised.
They might have tried to use that, depending
Yeah.
on exactly how it was worded. That's right.
Yeah,
That's why even
They-
when sometimes you win at a local level, you ultimately lose.
Yeah.
Because they go to court
yeah,
and say that any
But-
number of their, you know,
yeah.
they
No, 'cause that
turn
one
the
is-
Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment on its head, on its collective head.
It certainly wasn't going through the minds of the people that voted on it back in 1870, that's for sure.
Ron,
Yeah, you talked early on about the way things were with corporate charters, you know, and I thought to myself, in fact, I wrote down, those were the days. And I'm wondering if to what extent you think it's possible to go back to something like that? Is it possible? Is that in the We the People Amendment?
no, I mean, you know, We the People Man was actually more far reaching in a sense. But it would allow certainly the ability to define and authorize and limit. It would be a state mechanism to do that. Was, you know, limiting the amount of money or prohibiting corporate expenditures or creating public financing or whatever. So chartering could be, it's still possible. You know, every company is still chartered somewhere. Now, many of them, of course, have to, as I mentioned before, the charter mongering state, sort of the equivalent of an individual, right, a century ago, escape the law, they'd run to Mexico. Well, that's what corporations do when they run to, you know, Delaware. So they escape that. But, you know, those companies that still are chartered in states, at the very least, almost every one of them says, you know, and we blah, you know, do this and that and all, and we have to follow the law. So if they break the law in any fundamental way, technically that grounds for revoking the charter. And when that was done in the past, you know, how that, I mean, usually what happened is when a charter was revoked, either the company itself was just dissolved and its assets was, you know, handed out to maybe whoever was harmed by whatever harm that company caused, or it was just, you know, turned over to the state, or the company was taken over by a new set of owners. Now, the stockholders had to take a bath, but you know what? That should be part. Right now, you know, stockholders think that they will never lose money, no matter what they do. And they shouldn't care. They shouldn't care about what a company does, only what is its rate of return every quarter. That's about the only thing that stockholders and stock managers look at for the most part. Responsible investing aside. But otherwise, it's like rate of return, not whether you are destroying people, places, or the planet. And if some of that destruction at some point may blow up in that corporation's proverbial corporate face, and if that happens, you as an investor should lose your shirt. That should be what happened. And that would happen if a company was dissolved, as it once was, and could happen again. And it's still technically possible, but of course, states and legislators will do everything they can to stop short of that. Fine them. They'll limit, like if they can receive state contracts for a period of time, or just demand that, the CEOs or the board of directors changes, right? Turnover. So they'll do that kind of, basically Band-Aid stuff. And oftentimes when they're fined, if you look at if they're publicly traded stock, if you look at the stock that day or the next day, their stock actually goes up. Oh, they were only fined $250 million, which sounds like a hell of a lot of money, which is to you and I, $250 million is less than what a company makes 1/4 of a year in many instances. So that's not really making them accountable. Just getting rid of a CEO is not making the corporate entity accountable as a separate entity apart from the individuals who are a part of it. That's what charter revocation does.
Well, they have had various court cases where corporations have damaged the environment or caused or put out products that were dangerous, and it seems like they were able to be pretty well walloped by some pretty substantial verdicts, but they never attacked their charter as such. It was mainly damage that they've caused or inflicted either across state lines or to the public generally.
Yeah.
That seems to have been about the only thing that's actually had some effect on some of these. Look, we just had this horrible rail disaster in Ohio. That's yet to play out, but it looks like
Right.
That's almost 100% negligence on the part of that particular corporation. So we'll see where that goes. But
We'll see where that goes. But you're quite right in terms of, Mike, that there have been instances where individual companies have had to pay, but because of certain state laws, again, what has happened is that these companies now have become very ingenious, very innovative. And when they see that fine is about to come, they'll create a new company, a shell company. They'll transfer some of their liabilities to that company. They'll create the shell company, transfer the liabilities, but not transfer assets. So when it comes time to pay out, guess what? They have to declare bankruptcy. It's basically what happened, in a number of instances with tobacco companies. Monsanto, got taken over by Bayer, and were able to kind of offshore some of the instances with the glyphosate and Monsanto. So this is becoming a popular way to avoid even financial accountability. Never mind legal accountability, but even financial.
yeah, Charlie, you had your hand up briefly.
Oh, just a comment. On our local KPFA news, I heard that regarding the Ohio rail crash or accident, that the company, on corporate media, I heard that they're setting up clinics in the town of Palestine and setting up clinics. But on KPFA radio, it said the clinics are not clinics. They're referrals. You go there, you sit down, there's no medical staff, and they just look at you and they give you a name of somebody to go see. That's all. But they want to make it look like, like they're doing something when they're really not.
Well, there's all sorts of ways that companies try to avoid, through laws, and they get, corrupt legislators to go along with it, to pass state laws. So, just think of all the things that, you may get $100 or $1,000 or whatever, but then you have to sign off saying that company's no longer liable. You can no longer
Oh,
sue
that's a
them
problem.
beyond that. So there's all sorts of ways that they work. And,
Problems
just
rise
think,
up later.
yeah, just think of a company in your neck of the woods, PG&E.
Yeah.
What kind of ultimate accountability? I mean, look at the damage, the number of deaths, the property destruction, the
They're
injuries caused, and what, they got fined, right?
It should be broken up. It's like a monopoly. It should be
Yeah.
busted up into small companies.
Why is that company still in existence? Given the kind of if I can't think of a single mobster or a single serial killer that has caused remotely the amount of damage and harm. But, are they, a lot of companies want to say, okay, you're persons. Well, in some places for a while, they had this thing called 3 strikes and you're out, right? So they want to be a person until something like that applies to them. When they have, say a company or been responsible for deaths or felonies or something, they don't want to suffer the same fate as an individual who has murdered someone or has committed multiple felonies.
To me, it looks almost impossible to change the situation. It's just so horrendous. It's kind of overwhelming.
That's why we have to
PG&E
say, sorry, you don't have the right. The first step is to sort of change our way of thinking. That you don't have the right to do what you think you're doing, wherever you're doing, whatever you're doing. You don't have that right. We have now, maybe right now you do, but we are saying, no, you don't. And we're going to work against you, and we're going to try to eliminate your
Somewhere in your presentation, you mentioned system change. Caught my ear. That I think maybe we need to be looking at that more.
Well, and we are, in a sense. Move to amend and the We the People amendment is a piece. But there's many other changes that need to happen. Karen.
Karen, you still got your hand up, or is that from
Yeah,
the last
before.
time?
Yes, actually, when you talk about like PG&E in California, and certainly Enron, which was, I'm in Oregon, so Portland Gas and Electric, everybody was impacted by that. And the money that we had paid for taxes, of course, they didn't pay taxes with it. And not only did people lose their jobs, they lost all of their pensions, and there were so many suicides. We certainly have our work cut out for us, and we need to.
Didn't that Pension Guarantee Corporation kick in? Like I put in 24 years with a company that went bankrupt, and yeah, you got a fairly small fraction of what I originally would have probably received, but the federal pension, let's see, what's called Federal Pension Guarantee Corporation, I think, did assume some of the liabilities, and then the law was changed somewhat after that. And because yeah, people that have spent their whole working life at a company all of a sudden, oh, sorry, we're gone. Go chase yourself for your pension. That really did strike a chord in Congress, and they did pass that. Now, whether or not it isn't enacted toward utilities, I don't know.
The thing is, boy, it's a constant battle, because if there's any improvement, like as in the safety issues with the trains, the braking systems, they're overturned when you get the wrong legislators in there, or the extremely corrupted, and we do have a big network working to do that. And just on the rent, just quickly, in Oregon, at the state level, we did pass a limit on the amount that rent can be raised. And of course, the industry fought it. And we're working on other issues now. And in both Portland and Multnomah County, they managed to keep big money out of local elections. And overwhelming, the voters passed that, both places.
Very good.
So,
Can I ask who is the congressperson in your area?
well, we have a new congressional district, so our senators are Jeff Merkley
Right.
and Ron Wyden, who are generally really good. My former representative was Bonamici, and she supports Move to Amend. And I'm in the new House District 6, so that's Andrea Salinas. And she's a really conscientious, thoughtful person.
Good. Try to get her. And how about in San Mateo? Who's your congressperson?
We have a new congressperson, so that's one thing that we can
Yeah,
work on. That's Kevin Mullen. He was an assembly person.
Yeah,
And is
so we've
he?
had-
What's his politics like?
He's
Mostly-
good. He's pretty
yeah,
good.
similar to Jackie Spear, our older one, because she endorsed him completely. So
Yeah, and Peace Action endorsed him. You know, he
Oh, okay.
answered our questionnaire in all the right ways. So
Great.
he's open and amenable, and San Mateo and the surrounding areas for his district are they resonate with him and vice versa. So in these kinds of things.
but I distinctly remember our last congressperson, Jackie Spear, was violently opposed to that Citizens United decision. I was very impressed by her when she was just saying, spitting fire and saying, so anti-democratic. And to his credit, Obama did call them out, right? They were sitting right in front of him at the State of the Union address. I remember that very unusual thing where he actually kind of pointed at these people right in front of him, saying he really felt was wrongly decided, and I give him a lot of credit for that.
Yeah, and Alito, so shot back. Yeah.
Well,
Well, your new
that's-
person, your new person, it's great to hear that he signed your pledge or met your conditions. If we organize something in trying to get him to be a co-sponsor, maybe one of you would be willing to be part of that.
Exactly, which item would that be?
Well, it would be a virtual meeting with a aide.
Signing on to the We the People Amendment.
Yeah,
I see.
and making the connections between peace and militarism, anti-militarism, and peace.
Any idea how close we are to introducing HJR 48?
I
so it
think
could be
we're in
40.
the mid-30s. We got to get 47.
Interesting. They can't just say we want 48 and put it up there. They got to wait for their turn.
We got to
huh?
wait. You can't introduce
will.
48 until there's 47.
Now, this is a federal item or?
Yeah.
It's federal.
House joint, it's a joint resolution in the House.
Right.
It's been introduced. How many terms in a row, Greg? How many has it been?
5,
It's
We
got a
get
lot of
more.
co-sponsors.
more support each and every time. So
Well, certainly that would be an item worthy of bringing up. Hopefully, we're going to have a meeting with him, Zoom or otherwise. That would be definitely one item to sound him out on.
Yeah,
Ron, have you got Greg's mailing address? We'd like to send our.
I will get his address.
Thank you so. That's a good idea. Let's see, Karen, one more item for you, or you're just
Okay.
waving at us there?
Karen's
Oh,
hand
did I?
is raised from before.
Okay,
Did I lose my train of thought? I
that's
think
quite all
I
right.
lost
quite all
That's
right.
right. We've had a lot of problem with trains lately.
the train accidents,
True.
All right, any other,
accidents.
any closing remarks by anyone? Want to, aside from wanting to thank Greg for staying up late with us?
Thank you. It's very interesting. Lots.
Yeah,
going
well
on.
presented, Greg. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Greg.
Well, let me just invite you as your group to consider endorsing. A number of peace actions have endorsed. I live in Greater Cleveland area, and the Cleveland Peace Action
Oh,
endorsed a number of years ago.
excellent.
I
excellent.
don't see why we wouldn't.
No, yeah, really. I just send
Yeah,
it
our
along.
board meets-
We have our
Well-
big rubber stamp ready to go.
In the chat, there's a link to right under endorse organizationally. So if you click
Okay.
on that, it'll take you to the page that has a link to a form that you can fill out and endorse and send
Okay.
back electronically.
Or if also you could maybe, in case it doesn't get lost, send an email to Ron with that info as well. Just have two different sources so we don't get it lost anywhere.
I will save all the links. I just
Okay.
punched, I clicked them all, and so they're up on they're on my browser right now, on my
Alright.
web.
Appreciate
So I'll
that, Ron.
just- I'll save the links in something. I'll
Okay,
have-
And
so with that, I want to thank everyone. Unless someone's got a closing item, I'll let Greg close it out, but do want to extend our appreciation for all his efforts. That was very, very interesting.
Indeed, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
well, thank you. I
Thank
just put in the-
you. Thank
I
you,
just-
Greg.
Is this in
Very-
the chat?
Very
Very
interesting.
welcome. I just put two things in the chat, two additional things.
Good.
Little shameless self-promotion.
Yay.
Mine-
Need a little of that.
I put together a calendar. Every week, it comes out every Monday morning, called a Real Democracy History Calendar. It's free, it's electronic. Just sort of looks at the history of democracy, defined very broadly.
Thank
For
you.
that week. So there's a place to sign
Wow.
up and, check that out. And then the other thing is a link to the book that I've recently, as of last year, wrote.
Oh.
So it's a link to
Thank
that,
you.
more information about it. Check it out.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay, yeah, with that, we'll sign off, right, Laura?
Yes.
Take
Thank you,
care, y'all.
everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks again, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank-
Good night,
thanks,
everybody.
Greg.